All right, welcome to our next lecture. We just finished up the Middle Ages, or the medieval period, also known as the Dark Ages, which is called that because it falls between two sort of peaks of art history. The Classical period, which is ancient Greece and Rome, and the Renaissance, which is what we're going to be talking about in this lecture. The difference between art that was made in the Middle Ages and this sort of idea of the Renaissance, which means rebirth, is that the art being made was more lifelike in this sort of return to classical Greek and Roman stylistic traditions where, the nude body is celebrated. The figure is anatomically correct, and they're trying to imitate nature. They're trying to be more lifelike and incorporate illusionistic space. So what we have is this sort of shift in interest from this sort of supernatural world that we saw represented in Byzantine art, early Christian art, then Byzantine art, early medieval art, and then Romanesque and Gothic. And so now there's this sort of rediscovery of the Greco-Roman tradition, which helped artists produce visual images that were more accurate. It also aided the expansion of scientific knowledge, such as the understanding of anatomy and perspective. Painters of the 15th century and 16th century went beyond Greek and Rome in their technical proficiency, is what we're going to see happen. So we're returning back to Rome in Italy, and what we see taking place is this sort of formation of these city-states. There's a maritime power that develops in North Italy, and there's an organization of successful merchants that created communal governments, and therefore these prosperous city-states, such as Florence, Siena, Tuscany, and Padua, and other cities. What we'll see in the early Renaissance or the pre-Renaissance is this sort of idea of civic pride and civic identity. And so we're going to start off in the 1400s in Italy. And in the early 1400s, there was sort of an awakening where the world seemed to wake up. This started in Florence, Italy, and this is where we typically think of this sort of Renaissance or rebirth occurring, although we will travel later to North Europe and look at the Northern Renaissance in France and in regions like Burgundy, and up into Germany and Belgium. And basically, both with the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance, there were common elements of rediscovery of art and literature of Greece and Rome. The scientific study of the body and the natural world, and the intent to reproduce the forms of nature realistically. So we see a shift and return to that stylistic convention. During this historical period, there's also a growing sense of artistic identity. We'll start to actually really have to know a lot of names of artists. You haven't really had to know too many up until this point. And so this idea of artistic identity emerges. And then, we start to see that the artist records their names, and definitely this sense of wanting to leave their mark on the world, and also this sort of the sense of being aware of that. Whereas before, artists were considered more laborers, and there was a sort of, they remained anonymous. Artists were aided by new technical knowledge, again, like the study of anatomy. And what we'll see happen is that artists achieve new heights in portraiture, landscape, mythological and religious paintings. As their skill increased, the prestige of the artist soared, reaching its peak during the High Renaissance, which is between 1500 and 1520. And so we start to see this idea or this birth of the art star or the art superstar. And so you start to hear names like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, and I'm sure you've heard of these artists' names, but they become these sort of art stars of the Italian Renaissance. To give you a context of what was happening during the Renaissance, such things as the exploration of new continents was taking place. Scientific research boosted man's belief in himself, while at the same time the Protestant Reformation decreased the sway of the church, which I think allowed this sort of return to these classical stylistic conventions. But we still will be looking at Christian themes and ideas as well. And here's a close-up of the area that we're going to be looking at, Rome and Florence and Siena in particular. So earlier I talked about this theme of civic pride, and we really see that emerge in a lot of the artistic traditions of these independent cities, Siena, Florence, Padua. We're going to take a look at Siena first and Sienese painting. So this is an aerial view of the town of Siena, and a view of the Siena Cathedral at the Palazzo Pubblico. And Siena is a very medieval city. It's a walled city, and it's made of red brick, and that's how it gets its name, that sort of red, sort of reddish-brown color. If you're an artist or have painted, you've probably heard of the color sienna or burnt sienna. What you're looking at now is an aerial view of the town hall. Siena has a great horse race tradition, again, which is an important reference to their civic identity. Siena had a very organized civic structure called the Nine, which consisted of 9 councilors who governed the town during a set period of time, which was about 2 months. And also note the gigantic lookout tower as well, going back to this sort of medieval tradition. A lot of these cities were kind of competing with each other as well, and so, they did have to have some sort of defense, embedded in their civic structure. This is another view, and again, you can sort of see how the city has this sort of slightly concave facade. Again, it's protected by heavy walls and battlements, and it's very fortified and protected. This is another view, and note these fortified parapets, which are these sort of lookout or watchtowers, and also you've probably seen this in movies where military could sort of stand above and defend the city. So again, the point of all this is to show you that Siena was a very proud city, and it was also a political and commercial rival to Florence, which we will look at later as well. So what we're going to look at are some fresco paintings. Siena, the town of Siena, commissioned mural paintings for the inside town hall that we just looked at. This was a civic commission, which is something, a little bit refreshing, because we've been looking at a lot of, religious and church architecture as patron of the arts. And so this series of frescoes was meant to serve as a sort of didactic, sort of teaching painting. And it was actually aimed at the 9 counselors who met in this room. It was designed to remind them of the virtues of good government and the vices of bad government. So this is one of your first artist names, Ambrogio Lorenzetti, and he was commissioned to do this series of frescoes related to good and bad governments. And we'll take a closer look at them. And so this is the layout of how they are painted in the room where the 9 met. So, you know, off to the side here we have the city-state under tyranny. So these are going to be examples of bad government. In the middle, the virtues of good government, and then adjacent, the good city republic. And we're going to look at these panels individually. And then just to give you a sense of the view of what it looked like. As you can see, there has been some you know, loss of the frescoes. So something else I want to point out too, Italy mostly did fresco painting, where they would put pigment on wet plaster. When we move to the Northern Renaissance and get into North Europe, they really become very progressive in oil painting and become pioneers in that medium. So keep that in mind. But remember, with wine fresco or wet fresco, it is very fragile, and so a lot of fresco paintings, you know, have been lost because of their delicate nature. So what we're looking at here is a detail of the Allegory of Good Government. We do see some throwbacks to earlier traditions, such as hierarchic scale. You know, we do have these allegorical figures that we'll talk about in detail that are larger than these figures at the bottom, who are probably the citizens of Siena. And so, again, there is this depiction of allegorical figures. We have peace, justice, and wisdom, sort of in this top portion of the composition. And then we have the citizens at the bottom of the composition. We also see a group of prisoners depicted. And so this is supposed to be an allegory of what good government should be. And this is another detail. We also see the depiction of architecture, and it is recognizable, and it is recognizable to the city of Siena. One of the things, if you are familiar with the town, is that you can see the cathedral dome and the striped campanile, or the bell tower, here in the background. Right here. It's kind of small, but recognizable. And so this is important because it's one of the first panoramic landscapes, or in particular urban scape, since Roman antiquity. So think back to some of the panel paintings that we saw in some of the villas of Pompeii. The artists used the town of Siena as a prototype of the painted depiction. The artist even renders the inhabitants of the city, which we will look at in a little bit more detail. So when you have the 9, or this sort of ruling government in this room seated, you know, talking about politics and civic responsibilities, what are they supposed to get out of looking at this painting? So some things that you should note are that the buildings are well maintained. The buildings larger in scale than buildings around them. Again, this isn't illusionistic space. Again, this is a transition period, but we will start to see this shift towards more classical and illusionistic representations. And this is done intentionally to really sort of act as a sort of a frame, or to highlight all the activity that's happening, sort of in this foreground with the citizens. And the artist is showing scenes from shifting viewpoints, again, which is something that we saw with early Christian and Byzantine art, sort of these multiple narratives happening. So here's a detail of the architecture, so you can get a better look at it. I should have shown you that earlier. And we're going to kind of move down here into the foreground and look at the activity of the citizens. And so, again, we see these examples of prosperity and commerce happening. These are sort of individual storefronts, so we see this idea of trade and commerce. We see education represented as well by a teacher or lecturer standing at a podium. And again, these are all meant to serve as examples of good government in the city. We're moving to another part of the composition that features 10 dancers in the middle of the street. There are many discussions about what this is supposed to represent with art historians, and it is believed that they are the representation of Venus's children and could perhaps be a metaphor of the harmony of the city. So again, we're kind of going back to this sort of Greek and Roman tradition and sort of these some of these pagan symbols and gods and goddesses. Now we're moving from the urban city into the countryside, and so this is supposed to be a panel representing good government in the countryside. Again, the landscape of the countryside is idealized, but it's also still recognizable to Siena. And it has been discussed that the landscape does resemble the countryside in Siena. We see a winged allegorical figure who is meant to represent security. We see the nobility hunting, and also agriculture and farming appears very prosperous and fruitful when we kind of look at some of the details in the composition. Bridges have been built, and again, these would have been funded by the government. So again, this is this idea of examples of good government going on in the countryside. And here is a detail of that allegorical figure of security. And again, here we see a nude woman, and again, it is very sort of stylized, but definitely referencing these sort of that classical tradition of sculpture from ancient Greece and Rome. Here's a detail of the nobility hunting in the countryside. And again, a detail of the agriculture going on in the bridge right here. Alright, so we've looked at good government. Now we're going to take a look at the allegory of bad government. And as you can see, this is the part that has suffered the most decay, which is unfortunate. So when the viewer turns to examine this mural, they're confronted with very devious-looking figures. They're adorned with horns and fangs. Again, we see this use of hierarchic scale, where the allegorical figures are much larger than these sort of, looks like these terrified citizens in the foreground. And some of the figures even appear cross-eyed. And this center figure is identified as Tyranny. He sits enthroned, resting his feet upon a goat, which was a symbol of luxury, and in his hand he holds a dagger. Below the tyrant is this captive figure of justice, right here that we saw earlier. While the figures, or these allegorical figures of cruelty, deceit, fraud, fury, division, and war flank him, right here. And above him, other allegorical figures float, which include avarice, pride, and vainglory. And you don't have to know who these are, but I just wanted to show you this. Here we see the architecture being depicted again, although now it looks very dilapidated. It seems to be falling, certain structures seem to be falling apart and falling into disrepair. We see murder and violence taking place in the streets. And so this is examples of government not working efficiently. And again, this would be viewed by the nine, this sort of ruling body of citizens that were elected for a 2-month period, to be, for them to contemplate. All right, so now we're going to move to the city of Florence. Remember, Florence was a rival to Siena. So here's an aerial view of Florence. I'm sure you've seen the dome of the Baptistery. This is Brunelleschi's dome. Like Siena, the Republic of Florence was a dominant city-state. Florentines were very proud of their perceived economic and cultural superiority. There was a lot of banking going on in Florence. I'm sure you've heard of the Medici family. So Florence controlled the textile industry as well as the Republic's gold. The florin, which was a monetary system, was used as the standard coin or exchange. Alright, so we're looking at the baptistry of San Giovanni, which was dedicated in 1059. It is a sort of Romanesque building, and then we're looking at the mosaics in the Florence Baptistery during the second half of the 13th century. And this was done, obviously later. And this is where, this structure is located in the Palazzo della Signori, and this is where Florence's ruling body presided. And so Signori is medieval Latin for lord, just in case you were wondering. And the reason why we're looking at this is because we're really interested in looking at some of these doors, this set of bronze doors that was commissioned for the baptistry. They were made out of bronze, which was an ancient technology referred to as the loft wax process. So again, we're this idea of enlightenment and this starting of this rebirth of these sort of ancient Greek and Roman traditions that have been lost. We still are, there are still remnants of the Gothic era. Note the quatrefoil motif. So this is definitely this that frames these different scenes, which is definitely a Gothic influence. There were 3 sets of doors that were commissioned at the time for the baptistry. And again, these commissions show how important the structure was to the citizens of Florence at the time. These are just some details. We'll be looking at another set of doors. So the set of doors was completed in 6 years. Overall, the overall effect is sort of a 2-dimensional decorative sort of grid that's composed of 28 rectangles with repeated quatrefoils. It's in terms of looking at the figures and the composition, there's graceful patterns, poses, and delicate human figures that fill the squares. Within the quatrefoil frame, the figural compositions do sort of have a 3-dimensional form. So again, that sort of, this sort of transition from this sort of Gothic period into what I call the sort of proto-Renaissance or pre-Renaissance. And again, some of these, I'm sure you've noticed, the blue stars have not been on many of these. But it is very important contextually for you to understand this history, for you to really understand, the high Renaissance and the late Renaissance art that we're going to be looking at. So it is, it is important that you see these images and this earlier work. That's also why I showed the video that we looked at yesterday as well, because I feel like the College Board has sort of glossed over a lot of the important, some of the important precursors to the Renaissance that I think are needed in order for you to understand that time period better. Now we're going to go to the city of Padua, which was another independent city-state. This city is important because of an artist referred to as Giotto, and this is sort of some quotes about him, but he really, without him, this idea of Renaissance painting and these big names that we think of with the high Renaissance, like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael, this would not have been possible without the work of Giotto. And so these are just different quotes from different historians and philosophers about Giotto. So this is on your list of 250 works that you should be able to identify and know very well. This is the Arena or Scrovegni chapel in Padua. It was constructed between 1305 and 6. And Giotto is perhaps best known for the frescoes he painted inside the Arena chapel. They were commissioned by a wealthy man named Enrico Scrovegni, who was the son of a well-known banker, and he was a banker himself. According to the church, usury, charging interest for a loan, was a sin, and so perhaps one of Enrico's motivations for building the chapel and having it decorated by Giotto was to atone for this sin of usury. It has also been suggested that Enrico built the chapel in penitence for his father's sin of usury, and to obtain absolution for his own. Enrique's father, Reginaldo degli Scrovegni, is one of the usurers encountered by Dante in the seventh circle of hell. So that reference to him in this work of literature really shows you how bad he must have been. So the exterior of the church is very plain, but it's the inside that we're really interested in. This is a reconstructed drawing of the site. The Arena Chapel is referred to that since it was built on the site of an ancient Roman arena or amphitheater that later became the property of the Scrovegni, whose palace abutted the chapel. The palace was torn down in the 19th century, though parts of the arena remain. So this is the original site that we're looking at. Commissioning the work of art for churches, again, was a common way of doing good works in terms of Christians, trying to, get into heaven and get into good graces with God. And so, again, we see this sort of function of art working in this way. So let's take a look inside of the chapel. The reason why Giotto is so important is that he's the artist who takes the biggest step away from the medieval style and the sort of spiritual representation in painting in the early 14th century that we saw. You can see that there are numerous separate images in the chapel, and the frescoes tell the story of the lives of Mary, beginning with her parents, Joachim and Anna, and Christ and the story of Christ on the long walls. By the altar, And hopefully this plan seems familiar to you. It's reminiscent of a basilica plan. We see other images, the Annunciation, and then also the Last Judgment. We've seen that before, hopefully you remember, with Romanesque and Gothic architecture, where they would have often Last Judgment scenes over the portal, the entryway into the church. These were relief carvings over the tympanum. So you can see the Greek and Roman tradition. We have a simple barrel vaulted room, and Giotto painted the entire barrel vault using wet fresco. There are 12 scenes dedicated to the life of the Virgin. The life of Christ is also depicted as well. We see these really lovely little stars that sort of are studded against this blue sky. The blue had to be done in dry fresco, or fresco secco, S-E-C-C-O, because the blue, when it was done in wet fresco, would not be as, would not be this beautiful, deep, really saturated blue color. So it had to be done in this dry fresco, and often because of that, because it was done with dry plaster, it has flaked off. So that's usually the first color pigment that usually gets lost when we're looking at these early Italian frescoes. So here we're looking at a detail of the wall, and so Giotto tells the story of Christ and his parents through pictures. Remember, most of the population of Europe was illiterate at the time, and they could not read the Bible for themselves. Again, Bibles were very rare and expensive in any case. There was no printing press at the time, it hadn't been invented yet, and so each copy of the Bible had to be done in hand, these gorgeous illuminated manuscripts that we looked at earlier. So people learned the stories of the Bible that would help them get into heaven by hearing the words of the priest in the church, and also looking at the paintings and sculpture around them. Decorations of chapels not only atoned for the Scrovegni's family sins, but also exhibits his power, sophistication, and prestige. And so you really do see the sort of multifunctional purpose of art. We see representations of virtues and vices down here at the bottom that line the bottom of the wall. They almost look like faux marble, and these are referred to as allegorical gracili. They're these sort of monochromatic looking paintings. It's paint. It's 2D, but it's meant to sort of look like relief sculpture. And again, think back to that idea of panel painting in Pompeii, where they did the faux marble technique. There's also a word that you should be familiar with, trompe-l'œil, which means French for to deceive the eye. It's spelled Trompe hyphen L apostrophe O-E-I-L, trompe-l'œil. And this was a technique used in painting where the imagery was so realistic, it really created this almost optical illusion, and so that the objects depicted look really three-dimensional. And then this idea of this forced perspective, you can sort of see it, this idea of architecture and this sort of faux stone, like this looks like architecture, but it's all painted, and this sort of inlaid stonework. So what we're looking at here is a panel that depicts the parents of Mary, who were elderly at the time and beyond childbearing age. Joachim had tried to have children, and Joachim is depicted as taking a sacrifice to the temple to help his wife conceive, and he's being thrown out, basically, and rejected. And so there are a couple of things I want you to note. Note how Giotto uses the architecture to create this sort of stage like space. You know, the architecture almost looks like a dollhouse for the figures in the composition to sort of interact with each other. Again, note the use of directed gazes. That's another sort of innovation, and these sort of expressive gestures of the figure. And the figures, you know, really don't look like medieval figures anymore. They have gravity and weight and mass. So again, this stylistic shift back to classical traditions. We'll go on. This is a sort of X-ray view of the painting, and I wanted to show you this just so you could see, again, the way fresco painters had to work. So they had to work in sections, and they had to paint a section of a wall at a time. And so you can actually see, and they refer to these as joints, and this represents a day's work. And so we can sort of see how Giotto progressed through these studies of these joints. And it took about 9 days for him to paint this one scene. Here we're going to look at another detail and look at it in sort of a monochromatic view. So here we see the priest of the temple like physically ejecting Joachim out into the open space right here. This open space, or this idea of negative scale in the composition, might serve as a metaphor for the void and emptiness of Joachim and his wife not being able to have children. And so the idea that the couple feels empty because of their plight. Barrenness was also interpreted as a sign that the couple was not in good favor with God. Note the use of modeling and shading being utilized. This monochromatic example is meant to show you this technique. And so again, we really start to see the shift away from these sort of flat, very stylized, you know, medieval figures. And you know, again, these figures have weight and gravity and a sense of three-dimensionality about them. We're looking at a close-up of another section. So inside the temple, we see a younger man being blessed. And again, this is meant to contrast with Joachim, who is being rejected because of his old age. So again, this really shows how Giotto is a very economic painter, in that everything has, you know, meaning and logic. And this is a trait that we see with Giotto's style, where he often depicts narratives through this idea of contrast. This is another example with Joachim among the shepherds. So these young shepherds right here sort of exchange these unsure glances while the dog is very jovial and playful. And here we see poor Joachim hanging his head down. And again, this sort of sense of emotion and this use of clarity with his gestures really pushes the narrative of Giotto's work. So again, very, very thought out and very economic as a painter. We'll look at some other scenes. So this is a nativity scene. Again, note how the figures possess mass and weight. He's communicating a narrative, again, through this idea of basic human emotions. You know, this exchange of glances. And Giotto's not afraid to compositionally, if you notice here, slice the figure. That's not me. That's actually how the picture really looks. And he does this just to show enough to get the point across. You know, you don't need to see the whole frame. And this really is very modern if you think about it. I mean, this really, to me, almost references a snapshot, or this idea of photography, which, you know, is many, 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 many years in the making. And so this is very, very revolutionary, the way he sort of chops these figures. Just you know, at the time, just very unusual. And so again, this shows you how compositionally Giotto was a very dynamic painter. He's also incorporating foreshortening in the heads, the way they're tilted, again, to sort of emphasize the delivery of this miracle of Jesus taking place. And so we see this sort of exchange between Mary and the baby Jesus. And again, just showing you the joints. We'll look at some other scenes. This is the resurrection of Lazarus. Note the quatrefoil scene to the left. This depicts the creation of Adam. And so again, we have an Old Testament scene relating back to a New Testament scene. So this idea of prefiguration. And so this idea that Adam, you know, his birth, this Old Testament scene relates to the resurrection of Lazarus, his rebirth. So prefiguration. So again, even though we're talking about classical Greek and Roman sort of stylistic, this sort of shift into those stylistic changes, we still are dealing with Christian imagery. Compositionally, it's interesting again because we don't see all 12 apostles. We see Jesus and his 12 apostles. We don't see all 12 of them depicted. We see parts of them, but not always the whole figure. And again, this is a really dynamic use of composition, of slicing the figure. So again, this is really entering this very sort of modern style of painting that you're probably more familiar with. So we're going to look at a detail. This is the figure of Christ. Again, he's silhouetted against a saturated blue background. And he has this gesture of blessing that's being emphasized. Christ often depicted was depicted in profile, goes back to this tradition of coinage, the way emperors and rulers were nobly depicted on coins and currency. We'll look at some other details. We sort of get a clear physical line of gaze between the figures that direct the viewer's eyes through composition. You've probably heard me, if you've taken my photography class, talk about the psychic gaze, where whenever, you know, someone's pointing or looking in a composition, that, you know, we as a viewer are going to look as well. And so this is, again, the sort of modern use of design and composition. Notice how some of the figures in the background are covering their noses. And again, you have to think about this idea of Lazarus, who was in the tomb or presumably dead for 3 days. He probably would have not smelled very good. And so they're sort of shielding their noses from this sort of putrid smell of death. And so when we're looking at Giotto's work, you really want to sort of think about his style as being very referencing, and again, this hasn't been invented yet, but he has a very cinematography sort of style, and there's this sort of this sort of narration about it. And again, very modern, this sort of modern sensibility about his work, which again, I know we seem like we're really focusing a lot on Giotto right now, but really for good reason, because he really ushered in this, you know, this phenomenal period of the Renaissance that everybody adores and loves, and then again, these art stars like Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo probably would not have been possible without his innovations, Giotto's. Here we're looking at another scene. This is the Kiss of Judas. This is a Christian story that is not described in great detail in the Bible, but with Giotto's depiction, we see how he elaborates upon the narration. The helmets that the military wore were once like done in silver but have tarnished. That's why they look black. Note the placement of the spears and the figure's eyes, how they're in contact with one another. And again, this really helps direct the viewer's eye just in a specific orderly way throughout the composition. Half the sky is reserved for the weapons that simulate sort of a violent sort of visual, rhythm with their sort of, the use of the diagonal line. And again, he only focuses on a few figures in the foreground, and he does sort of slice some of the figures. Judas and Christ over here embrace in contrast to the chaotic background. The use of the curve of Judas's gold robe helps to move him forward, and also creates a frame that emphasizes or highlights Christ. The depiction of the moment when Christ is about to be arrested has and has been betrayed by Judas for 30 pieces of silver. So this is this sort of very dramatic moment that he's trying to capture. The figure in the pink robe in the foreground almost seems to sort of lean out into our space. And again, Giotto is creating a very dynamic and intimate narrative that would be very relatable to the viewer. Here we're looking at another detail, and again we see how Giotto really uses the body language and these sort of psychic glances to really express the sort of drama and emotion of the scene. And he really reveals the inner character of the two figures. He uses something called physiognomy, which is from the Greek word physis, meaning nature, and ignomon, meaning the judge or interpreter. And it was this sort of philosophy during this time period that the assessment of a person's character or personality from his or her outer appearance, especially their face, kind of revealed who they were. So Judas is depicted with a recessed forehead and also a receding hairline. He's not very handsome. He almost looks beast-like or ape-looking. And this use of this sort of animal or bestial quality in the depiction of Judas conveys this idea of his predisposition towards evilness and deceit. And so in contrast, Jesus, remember we talked about how Giotto really expresses emotion and also the narrative of the story through contrast, is depicted in a classical profile. He looks very handsome, very regal and noble. And Christ is looking into Judas's eyes as if to confront him, as well as accept his destiny gracefully. This is another detail of the figures in the foreground. Also, something unusual is that Giotto is showing the backs of figures. And so this figure here has his back to us, and it's almost used as a sort of device to filter and block the scene, as well as link central figures. Again, this very sophisticated use of composition to tell a narrative and direct the viewer's eye. So we're going to move to another scene, and I promise this will be the last one, I know. But it really is so important to understand the work of Giotto and then really understand this sort of modern shift into painting. And you do have to know this for this is the one that is really featured, or the one scene that is featured in your list of 250 works. It's the Lamentation, and here the Virgin is mourning her son after he's been crucified. Again, note the quatrefoil of Jonah and the well to the left, this Old Testament scene sort of prefiguring this New Testament. Again, we saw that with some of the early Christian fresco paintings we saw and some of the early catacomb paintings when we looked at that time period. Again, innovative use of composition because Giada places the cross off-centered. And the hillside exhibits a really strong diagonal line to direct the viewer's attention to the figure of Christ. So again, really, really unusual and innovative use of composition. We'll look at some of the figures in more detail. Note the use of this sort of white depiction of the skin of Christ and how it contrasts him with the other clothed figures, making him a point of interest. Across the wall from this panel is the nativity scene we looked at earlier. And again, this is very symbolic, showing both the life and death of Christ. And so not only are the individual panels in terms of their composition important, but the arrangement of these panels, throughout the structure are really thought out and symbolic as well. He's representing Christ as dead, and so he's not as idealized. Again, another very modern idea. He emphasizes his physical form. We see the depiction of Mary Magdalene at the feet of Christ with her beautiful red hair. Some other things to note. The tree without leaves signals its winter and serves as an analogy of the cycle of life. It will sprout leaves again in the spring. The feet of the figure on the right side really do help to ground the figure. So again, we don't have these sort of floating figures that we were used to seeing with medieval art. Remember, in particular with Byzantine, where they'd have their little feet sort of crossing each other. So a more realistic depiction. And also the use of facial expressions of the figures. And so we see them displaying different forms of grief. Some are resigned, flinging their arms out into space. And then other figures, like this figure here, and then other figures, like the figure of St. John, is more subdued and sort of noble. Here we see the angels they seem pretty distressed and grief-stricken. They tear their clothes, they pull their hair out. And so we don't have these detached figures anymore that we saw with the sort of medieval art that we looked at earlier. We see a sense of emotion, and we see Giada really exploring a sense of individual emotion within these different figures. Again, he employs the idea of the backs of the two figures in the foreground, and again, they're really meant as a compositional device. They're meant to, again, frame the figure of Jesus and the scene of this lamentation, and again, Mary looking and mourning her dead son, and they sort of are like brackets, framing this emotional scene happening here. And also too, if you look, they really seem to really be kind of spilling out into our space again. And again, that's something that we haven't seen before. So it really shows you this level of sophistication and the use of composition that we did not see earlier with in medieval art. We also see the use of foreshortening with the bowing of the heads of the figures as well. I'll get a little more detail. So again, I told you earlier that this scene recalls the nativity scene, and it is placed across, it is placed across from, they're placed across from each other. And so again, this idea of the cycle of life comes to full circle with how these panels are placed. In this scene, however, the figure of Christ is unable to return the gaze to his loving mother, where in the earlier nativity scene we saw, him being able to sort of return that emotional love. And again, notice how her knees are raised to prop him up. And again, we're looking at this idea of nature and real life and the depiction of this Christian narrative. And again, just showing, here's the nativity scene. I should have had that earlier, but here we see how they do mimic each other. So a last judgment is placed so that when the viewer, it's one of the last images the viewer sees before leaving the chapel. I'm not going to talk about this. I'm going to leave off with the lamentation. But some things I want you to note too about the structure. This is actually a pretty small space, a very intimate space. Again, note the use of the barrel vault, which is, Roman or Romanesque feature. And then something called there's a detail of the Last Judgment scene. A triumphal arch is being utilized. These are just some details. And again, I wish I had more time to talk about this scene, but it's the lamentation was really what was the focus, or the work listed for your 250 works. So I won't go into too much detail. But one of the things I wanted you to note was how the apse itself looks like something called a triumphal arch, which was another, Roman classical sort of architectural feature. And, these were usually put up by a Roman emperor, to the gateway of the city, and they usually had relief carvings sort of depicting, these sort of victories or war victories. And so here again we see this sort of fusion of Christian iconography with Greek and Roman artistic, stylistic traditions. So I'm going to leave off here. This went way longer than I thought it would. I should have divided it into 2 parts. But I will see you in our next lecture when we go into we go further into the Renaissance, High Renaissance and Late Renaissance. I'm sorry, I messed up. Here's the view where it looks like a triumphal arch over here. All right, I'll see you soon.